80-ish books this year, which is pretty good for me. I mean, I'm not an absolute gun like some people are on BookTube. And I read a lot of chonkers as well. I read quite a lot in the last 2 months, so this is going to be quite a big video. As ever, the timestamps will be in the description. Please don't watch the whole thing. But I thought we could rapid fire go through some of these books because there's one or two of them that I want to talk about in depth, like the Ishiguro ones that I read. But the others I figure we can sort of just steamroll through and we'll finish up this trend that I've had this year and then we'll have a different trend next year, hopefully. The first book I read was The Bridge on the Drina by Ivo Andrić. I don't care. I don't care how to pronounce it. And this was a strong start to my reading month because I didn't write down any notes. Yeah, I thought it was good. I thought it was incredibly accessible, actually. It was very easily readable, so that was good. But I didn't take any more notes than that, I'm afraid. So, yep, I'd say is good. The next book I read, I did take some notes for because it was Tinkers by Paul Harding. And I thought it was boring and stupid. I'm starting to feel like a mental patient for liking This Other Eden, combined with the fact that I was the only person in my country who liked that book, and also the fact that I've now read Tinkers and I thought it was just another Anne Michaels again. Yeah, I thought this book was dumb, and I want everybody who read Held and liked Held to read Tinkers and tell me why you don't like Tinkers, because you will read Tinkers and go, huh, this is fucking bullshit, and you won't be able to justify why Held is good and Tinkers is bad, but both of them are bad. Tinkers is slightly better, but only just, and I couldn't stand reading it. I can see the things in Tinkers, which was a Pulitzer winner, that's crazy. I can see the things in Tinkers that made me like This Other Eden, like, I guess, the pretty language, the changing focuses, and so on. But in Tinkers, it feels like it's been filtered through, like, a mile of water, and it's purposeless, and it's made really muddy, and I couldn't stand it. All the way through the book, there is this insufferable sense of self-imposed profoundness where I couldn't figure out the tone at any given moment, and I took a couple of quotes to prove that. Here's a quote from early on. Once she snorted out loud, trying to stifle a thought. When she thought, my husband, the table. She felt so bad afterwards that she wept. So was that meant to be funny? Because the final line is this pretentious, oh, she wept because she thought he was a table. Oh my god. And if it was meant to be profound, then why is the last line so stupid? And why is the topic so stupid? There's a lot in this book where the author is the only one who thinks this is deep. I liked the randomness of the book at points, but there were moments when I found it difficult to determine, like, what was happening. I couldn't tell if it was the narrator talking or if it was an extended intertextual thing where there was a book within a book or a letter within a book, and I would often forget where we were or who was talking, and every now and again there's like an effective memory that comes through, but it's totally like it's a jump scare when it happens, and it was impossible to determine why we'd locked on to talking about any given thing and why the author was particularly focused at that moment. This Other Eden has so much plot, so much happens in that book that the language is not the sole thing you're focusing on. In this book it is, and the language is very labored and annoying. There's brackets within brackets, there's long tumbling sentences, and I just don't see the point. And this book is a writer thinking they're a genius without putting the proper balance in their writing, and I'm glad that This Other Eden is a massive step up from that. I still like that book, I still have it, but Tinkers, no, I'm not gonna read that again. Oh. The next book I read was a collection of short stories. It was the 9 Stories collection from J.D. Salinger. I remember reading Catcher in the Rye when I was like 15, maybe, and I remember being like, what the fuck is this? And I didn't get much out of it because I was a child. I read 9 Stories kind of on a whim. I got a PDF of it and I fucking loved it. I at the very least liked all of these stories, and they ranged from being pretty good to being so amazing that I was stunned I hadn't heard about them elsewhere. I really love the way that Salinger writes dialogue, and the second story is the best example of that. It has a real musical flow to it. There are lots of subtle character arcs in these stories that only make sense at the end. A lot of the meanings are very abstract and elusive. The third story in this book is very elusive, as an example, and that also has one of the craziest final sentences I've ever read in a short story. And I love how easy Salinger is making it seem. It's clearly incredibly well edited, and I love reading about the way that Salinger worked with The New Yorker in editing his stories, and The Banana Fish is a good example of that. But I think the best story in this collection was one called The Laughing Man. Ooh. I thought that story was immense and incredible. It spoke to me so much. It was perfect. The ending of the story was phenomenal. I actually clapped when I read it, which I never do. But I thought that story was fucking awesome. You could probably find it online. If you don't want to read the whole collection, just read that one. That one is amazing in my opinion. That's easily the best one. But yeah, where have these stories been? Do I have to read more from him? I will read Catcher in the Rye again probably next year after loving this. And I think 9 stories as a collection was one of the best things that I read all year. The next book I read was, to go on from my Austerlitz fill, it was The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald. Sebald is good at actual pretty writing, not the densely, monotonously opulent Samantha Harvey bullshit. The main reason I read this book is because Austerlitz by this author is my book of the year. It's still my book of the year. And Austerlitz has that step above Rings of Saturn in its focus, in how little it goes off track, and in the kind of subtleties in what it's talking about, and why every single thing in Austerlitz, though random, does tie back and does feel important. In the Rings of Saturn, there's no kind of bedding to it. There's nothing tying it down apart from the walking. Of course, there is stuff to tie it down from like chapter to chapter, and there is subtleties in it, but it wasn't anything that affected me as much as Austerlitz did. But there's lots of incredible writing. There's lots of interesting discussion on art and history that sort of seamlessly bleeds into each other, and I still liked the book. It's just not one that I'll come back to as much as I will to Austerlitz. The next book I read was probably my biggest surprise of the year, actually. The book that I was shocked I loved the most. And that was The Remains of the Day. So from Ishiguro, before reading this, I had previously only read An Artist of the Floating World, which is top 10 most boring books ever. And I also watched the movie Living, which he wrote the screenplay for, and I fell asleep in it. So I was like, oh god, I'm gonna read another Ishiguro. Why must I torture myself? And I read it, and I fucking nearly cried. I thought it was the best thing I've read in, like, ages. Before I talk any more about it, I should say that I gave the book a 4 out of 5 and not a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads, and there's only one reason why I didn't give it a 5, and that's because there is a superior version of the same story that I am left thinking about when I read the book. It's entirely my fault. If I read the book before seeing the amazing movie, then I wouldn't be thinking that, but there were moments where I was thinking, the movie did that just a little bit better. I love the unreliable narrator of this book, don't get me wrong, and I love how much Ishiguro proves to you by the end of the book that that is the point. You can't finish Remains of the Day and go, well, that was pointless, nothing happened, that was silly, why was he talking to us? Like, you can't really finish it like that. You can see what he's doing and it gets clearer as it goes. For me, though, the first-person perspective is not as interesting as the third-person perspective of a movie, because everything that is told to us in this book, or that we can sort of infer from what he says, I just find it more powerful when we see it written on someone's face, and it helps that Anthony Hopkins is, like, giving the performance of his life in that movie. But I do just prefer the movie a little bit, and I watched it again the second I finished the book, and I still think that. But everything in the book is still, like, fantastic. And just from, like, a conceptual level, keeping the main character at a distance makes more sense to me thematically than being in his head. Of course, Ishiguro makes it work, but it's just that sort of small preference for me in that way. Some moments in the book confuse me until I get what they're going for, and it just means that the emotion is a little bit delayed. Like in the movie, when you get to the bit where Hopkins is reading the book and Emma Thompson like tries to take the book off him, that's like the most powerful thing I've ever seen. And then in the book, when you're reading it, you're like, what's going on? Oh, I get it. I see what he's saying. You kind of have to, in every moment, you're deciphering what he's saying, and it just means that the emotion's a little bit muted for me. I don't necessarily need that, and I still love this book, but that's just my own personal thing. Another thing is that when I think of first-person, unreliable narrator books, there's a certain element of metatextuality in them that I kind of come to expect, and when a book doesn't do that, or does it in a weird way, it does affect my reading of it. And in this book, it was confusing me at points. When I say metatextuality, I mean that if it's an unreliable narrator account, I expect the book to answer why the narrator is talking to us and why he's saying things in the way he does, and this book doesn't really answer that. It does, but there are moments when he implies things, the main character implies things, in a way that doesn't make sense for him to do that, and it's only for the sake of the audience. And it doesn't happen a lot, in fairness, but the fact that the book doesn't answer the question of why Stephen's talking to us means that I get confused by that. I love the moments in this book when other characters break through, particularly the moment when the housekeeper says that she's getting married and then tries to provoke him into having an emotional reaction by being like, we laugh about you, you're actually a cock, and stuff like that. I love that moment so much. But in this book, like when the father dies, that's a really good example of what I'm talking about. When the father dies, Stevens reacts by going, oh, I see, oh yes, well, we have to get the tea. And he's implying to the person reading the book that he's actually a very, very good butler. He's very emotionally sort of controlled. He will worry about that later. He just has to fix this thing in the house. But then he mentions that one of the characters came up to him and said, "Stevens, you appear to be crying." And that's the breakthrough for the audience, where we go, okay, he's emitting certain things to us. He's actually very affected by this. He's just not telling us this. And I said, okay, if he's deliberately trying not to tell us that he's emotional, why would he include the section where somebody came up and asked him if he's crying? Why would he include that? And the book doesn't answer why he would do that. The only reason is for the reader to understand that there's more than meets the eye with him. But in that moment is a good example of why I think that some of the unreliable narrator stuff it doesn't quite work for me. There's like a couple of other tiny nitpicky things I have with this book too, like the section where there's these despicable government people who are like kind of bullying Stevens a little bit. I thought that conversation was a little too simple. That's literally it. Everything else about this book I thought was wonderful. I thought the main character was amazing. I thought the book had an incredible pace to it. It flowed really well. There was no moment where I was bored or going, get on with it in this book. It was so perfect and so it's simplified and made very clean. And the final moment between the two characters made me really emotional. It's a very quiet book, but it's amazing. And if you haven't read it, you totally should. I'd recommend this book to pretty much everybody, and I'd also recommend the movie too. The next book I read was one that nobody has heard of. It was a collection of selected poems by the Australian author Lesbia Harford. I read this book because it was in the Text Classics series, which is an Australian sort of publishing line. Shout out to Text Classics, because you guys are doing God's work, because they are saving some shit that would be forgotten. I'd never heard of this author. She wrote in the 20th century. She's seen as a queer icon or a feminist icon, at least in very small literary circles. And yeah, I love this. I thought this was great. These poems are really freeing and sweatless. This author has some very modern feeling poems, and I read this in an afternoon on a train, and my mood honestly improved for having read it. So yeah, I don't think this is one that people are going to be able to find, and I'm going to keep reading the Text Classic stuff in the new year, because god damn, I love this Australian stuff. And of course, after reading all of those good books, I was in the mood for some hearty, nourishing cringe, so I read Intermezzo by Sally the Socialist Rooney. I say I read it, I think I made it 50 pages before I had to dip, bro. This book sucks. Now, I know what you're thinking. Disco, you went into this book wanting to hate it. You're judging a book by its cover, and that's ridiculous. I didn't even see the cover before I started judging this book. I went into this wanting to hate it, and my opinion was rewarded. This book shows no development at all from her previous books. You might as well just read those. At the 50-page mark, I had to give up because Sally Rooney was not trying, and I, in turn, did not feel like I have to try. If you want to read a book with the same kind of temperament as a Sally Rooney novel, I'd recommend the Australian author Diana Reid. I've liked both of her books. She's kind of on a roll, and yeah, I'd shout her out because her books are not annoying and they're not appealing to a certain kind of reader. Well, they are, but not in the way that I find insufferable. I find Diana Reid very readable. I've liked both of her books, and they are better than these Sally Rooney snooze devices. My fucking phone died while I was filming. Oh! After reading all that, I decided to commit to a video idea that I've had for years, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to tell what that idea is by the books I'm about to talk about. I'll need a couple more months on it, but the next book that I read was by the author Patrick Modiano, and the book was called Dora, Bruder. This book is about the author tracing the life of a young girl during the occupation of Paris, and he's not living in that time, but he's looking back through archives and old notes and trying to trace the life of this girl and follow her movements in his own life. And as he retraces her steps, he integrates more and more of his own personal life into his telling and his attempt to try and find her. This book is Austerlitz, but 100 pages. I was thinking about Austerlitz the whole time while I was reading this. There's even a moment when Austerlitz is mentioned as a train line in this book, and I was like, oh! I actually ended up very invested in this author's attempt to figure out Dora's movements, and I loved some of the ways that he would do that. I loved his speculations and his way of filling in the gaps. When he'd lose Dora at one point, he'd turn to the weather at the time to determine if it was too cold for her to be outdoors, and so he'd look for other places. I loved the author's kind of way of trying to find the history of it, and that in itself was kind of a novelty that appealed to me. The feeling of the importance of the book grew as it went on, and it became clearer and clearer why the author is doing this, even if they are kind of self-referential and acknowledge their own grandeur in trying to do it. And the final image you get left of this book, with this recognition that there's a lot about Dora that we will never know. There's a lot of small things in her life, small moments and days that we miss where she must have been somewhere. And then because we pick her up again, we don't know how she felt at that point, what changed in her life. And it's kind of a recognition at the end that what he did was fruitless, and I actually really love that. The book is written kind of inconsistently. There are moments that are large info dumps, but there are clean poetic passages at points in the book that was so few and far between that when they happened, it was like, oh, I'm floating. Yeah, this book is super short, and I definitely recommend it. The next book I read is The Goalkeeper's Anxiety at Fucking Up the Free Kick by the uncontroversial Peter Handke, which is a book that documents the day-to-day life of your average League of Legends player. This was a weird book that dealt with weird feelings of nihilism in a weird way, and I don't know if I liked it. I think it was genius, but I hated reading it. Once again on the Disco King channel, we compare every book ever written to Austerlitz or American Psycho. This book did remind me of American Psycho, but it replaced the chaos of that book for this very dry, mean, simple spirit. The comparisons to Camus' The Stranger are a little forced to me. I don't think they're quite the same. I feel like the thesis in The Stranger is more readily told to you, whereas Goalie's Anxiety is a little more, like, held back, and it just refuses to give you the point of the book. I like this book more than The Stranger, but I think that Camus is absolutely the better author. A premise like this should not be longer than the length that this book is, so good job there, Pete. But I understand why the Goodreads rating for this book is so fucking low, because the author and the book are tremendously unlikable. Like, what the fuck are you meant to take from this? This book puts you in the head of somebody going mad in a way that I found super specific and very interesting, but it was not enjoyable to read. And there was a lot of really smart construction. I loved the lead up to the initial murder, and I love how you can kind of tell something bad's going to happen, but there's nothing in the writing that's telling you that. There were some quotes I wrote down because I loved what they said about the main character's mental state and his attempts to return to reality. And then there were points where I just wanted the book to fuck off. It's rare the books about sociopaths are liked by sociopaths, but this is clearly the rare exception. If you're a Peter Handke fan, you have to come out of the basement. This is a good book, 100%, but I did not enjoy reading it, and that will be the case for most people who are not deranged or so criticky that they've transcended enjoyment. I also read another book by Peter Handke called A Sorrow Beyond Dreams, which is a recount of his mother's life up to her suicide. Fucking hell. This book deals with similar themes of isolation, like personal isolation and dissociation and depression. I thought the writing in this book was excellent. There was a moment about 10 pages in when the author describes his mother in short bursts with semicolons, and I thought that was all great, especially bringing in the time period and the opinion of Hitler before he became kind of the head of Germany, and I thought that was all really scary shit, and it was a good kind of point to set the initial section in. I think what I loved the most about this book are the moments of wonderful self-awareness from Handke, where he recognizes what he's doing and why there's kind of like an ethical issue in doing it. One quote was, "These two dangers, the danger of merely telling what happened and the danger of a human individual becoming painlessly submerged in poetic sentences, have slowed down my writing because in every sentence I am afraid of losing my balance." It's Handke's attempt at being emotionally vulnerable, so it's still dour and sad. There are sections of this book where the writing is nearly identical to Goalie's Anxiety, to the point where if you change the main character in that book to female and plugged passages from A Sorrow Beyond Dreams into that, you wouldn't be able to tell that it came from a different book. There's also a relentlessness to his writing that makes it difficult to appreciate, and again, I felt that more in the back half of this book, where I was like, man, this is probably really good if I could even think about what it's saying. But there are lots of great quotes in this book, lots of great passages. Here's a good one. "Horror is something perfectly natural, the mind's emptiness. A thought is taking shape, then suddenly it notices that there is nothing more to think, whereupon it crashes to the ground like a figure in a comic strip who suddenly realizes that he has been walking on air." Ooh, what a good quote. So yeah, clearly he's a very good author. I understand why he won the Nobel Prize, but I'm not going to read any more from him for at least a decade. The next book I read was the book to kind of cap off my experience of Kazuo Ishiguro. I read Never Let Me Go. And what I've discovered while reading this author's work is that his books are apparently a coin toss between whether I think they're amazing or boring as fuck. I just did not stop scratching my head while I read this. Here's what my experience was. I got 50 pages in and I went, oh my god, can you stop tickling my balls? What are we doing? Then after getting through 100 pages and wanting to die, basically, I started to see more of a clear stride in the book. I started to enjoy it more. But then my brain started to analyze the world building of this book. And this book might have one of the worst worlds, one of the most nonsensical worlds of any book I've ever read. A world so dumb and so detached from the reality that I know that it's not even worth the hypothetical of the theme. Everything I loved about Remains of the Day was something I didn't love in this book. The simplicity of Remains of the Day is the absolute fucking secret juice in that book. Like, the simplicity of what is being said, the simplicity of every scene in the book, forces you to analyze the way that Stevens is talking. That's the way it works. It's the cleanliness of that book that makes you able to understand why Ishiguro is very smart in the way that he's telling the story. If there are similar ideas in this book of how to approach the story, then all of that is lost in how much this book is trying to do, and how much its world building fucking kneecaps the book. So the main premise of this book is that every main character is a clone, and all of these clones live to donate their organs and then die. They do like 4 donations or something, and then they die, or the book says completing. Oh, it's completing. I use that word so that it's less clear at the beginning of the book what we're actually talking about. Oh, I'm so smart. And the main theme of the book is recognizing the way that what people learn can influence the way that they react to certain things, where these people are taught to a certain way and they learn certain things, and that stops them from fighting back in a way and donating their organs. And I'm like, okay, that's the theme of the book. That's the theme. Why the fuck is it in this ridiculous world? These clones, if these clones are treated so inhumanly by the end of their lives and they're forced to donate all of their organs, why are they given the chance to be human? And by that I mean, why are they given the ability to have sex or roll around in a field and pick up diseases or fucking drive? Why are they allowed to do this? If their only point, according to the society of that time, is to donate their organs and then die, that's what they're there for. Why are they allowed to be in positions where they could affect that? All of these clones are presumably very expensive, so why are they not just kept in cages? If the society doesn't give a fuck about them, as is clearly seen in the book, then why are they allowed to just go out and get diseases and shit? Why is that allowed? Keep them in a fucking... hang them up, and then just cut the organs out when they grow up. Why allow them to do the shit that might affect the organ growing? How did this weird middle ground of treating them like kind of a human but not really develop? Like, they're allowed to be out in society and act like humans. How does the regular population not realize that this is an incredibly unethical thing? The book gives this lore dump at the end to kind of explain that, but it was nowhere near enough. This would never fly. Why are they allowed to fucking drive? They're not going to be a good organ donor if they're in a 6-lane pileup. That doesn't make any sense. How did the main character learn to drive? Why was she allowed? Does she have a fucking ID? Like, does that mean that she's a citizen then? Like, it doesn't make any sense. None of this book makes any damn sense. The world has the technology for perfect full human cloning that exists on like an industrial level, but it doesn't have the technology to, I don't know, like cure kidney failure. These sci-fi books are not moral quandaries when they exist in a world that's utterly alien to my logic. These organ harvesters should look like KFC chicken before it gets killed. They should not be allowed to drive and take dick. And even despite all that, by the time we get to the end of the book, I did not feel like the author successfully developed why the clones were accepting of their fate. I do not feel like the author did that. I get why they did that in a thematic level, or even in like a kind of romantic level at the end, where you they kind of accept their lives and it's kind of like a growing moment for them. But I don't understand psychologically why they did that, because this world exists in a way where there are a million little paths they could take to avoid their fate. The book spends most of its time showing how the characters have free will, so I don't accept the argument that, oh, the boarding school instilled it in them that they have to do that, and that's really the theme is actually conformity. The theme is not conformity, because it shows throughout the whole book that they have free will. The author is balancing between showing the theme of conformity by letting these people fucking die like cattle, or showing that they have free will by developing them as people and adding that kind of moral part to it, of like, see, these clones can be people too. You can't really have both, because then I'm thinking, well, if they're just people, why don't they just fucking avoid this and just go do something else? Is the government going to chase them up? Are there police that are going to hunt them down? Has any clone ever rebelled? Are you telling me out of the thousands of clones that exist, none of them have ever rebelled? What's the process? Why do things happen like this? This cannot possibly be a perfect system. Somebody must have fucked up at some point. Somebody must have like run away. How? What the fuck? The world of this book is not only dumb, but it also feels microscopic. It feels like we never get a good view of the world that we're working in, and that can be said to like relate to the themes of the book and how the main character only sees a certain part of the world, and that encourages her to react a certain way at the end. And I get that, but again, these people are normal people. They have access to the news, they can watch TV, they can see anything. If there are wide-scale unrest, or if there are clones who aren't accepting the system, they will see that and they'll go, hang on, I could just not do it and live? Fuck, I better do that then. I will say, when you class this book alongside other feel-bad novels like A Little Life, I wasn't actively cheering for these characters' death, unlike in A Little Life where every time Jude got hurt, I was like, yeah! There are things in this book that I liked, although a lot of them were more in theory. I like the, playing with the tropes of this kind of sci-fi genre by removing all of the characters' agency. I can see another version of this book where the characters learn about their fate and then escape and they're on the run from the cops, and the book deliberately doesn't do that. And again, the formatting of the book is very clear. I understand what it's trying to do. It's just built in this nonsensical world where I cannot take anything seriously. Why are people dying before their 4th donation? Did they not select perfect specimens who'd be able to take 4 donations? And if they did select perfect specimens, again, why are these people allowed to be in situations where they are made weaker and unable to complete 4 donations? It's clearly a waste of money. These people are totally independent, but we've never had any problems. Why are there all these extra steps in this book? Is the summary. Why are there all these extra steps? I'm paying attention to the nuance in Remains of the Day more readily because the book is not trying as hard as Never Let Me Go. I did not like Never Let Me Go at all. I did find it funny. I did enjoy reading it, but I can't say that it was something that left me really profoundly moved or anything. I could see the hints of what Ishiguro was doing at any given point, but I did not find it within myself to interrogate it further or interrogate how it made me feel, because as I've said, this world that has been created is not one that I find emotionally affecting or realistic or something I can relate to my own life. The next book I read after that was The Hunger Angel by Herta Müller. And this is probably the book that got Herta Müller the Nobel Prize, because I think she won it the year after she wrote this. It might have been too close, but anyway, this is the book that she is perhaps the best known for. And this book is sort of your standard light reading internment camp story. It's about Romanian Germans who are taken to the Soviet Union by Russians as repatriation after World War II and forced to work in labor camps. I've read stories centered around labor camps and people's experiences in them. Denisovich is a good example of that. And I didn't feel like The Hunger Angel really stood out from the crowd in that way. Even though this book is very evocative and very specific and very weirdly structured, it didn't do enough to stand out to me as like a passive reader. The structure of this book is actually identical to The Passport, which is one of the best books ever written. It's so good. But that book is like a third of the length of this one, and it's also doing something a little weirder and a little less real. And I did feel a lot of sagging in the format of The Hunger Angel, because there's no point in splitting it up when every story is just a direct continuation of the last one. This book takes a microscopic lens to every single fucking detail of this camp, and it's structured very weirdly, and there's not a lot of time dedicated to like evocative long passages or really like kind of envisioning the setting. It's a very odd book. It's also quite tough to tell how long everything is taking. Time is quite weird in this book, and in a good way. I thought that was actually a strength of the book. But weirdly to me, I think the biggest issue with the book is there was never a sense of urgency, and I was never worried for this main character. I felt like this was just another part of his life, and I know part of that is because we know that he survives. He tells us kind of at the beginning, or it's a past tense recount, but I still never really felt like the author was in any danger, and I never really related to him or felt for him. I don't really know why. I did love the ending of this book. There's a lot of mental patterns that are identified during the labor camp that come full circle at the end of the book when he's back in society, and I thought those last 30 or 40 pages were great and a totally necessary addition. But yeah, I just never really felt for him. I never really worried for him, which is weird because in Denisovich, it's like nail-biting. It's like, is he gonna fucking live or not? Is he gonna make it through the day? And then he does, and he's got a little spoon at the end, and you're like, oh, success. But in this book, I was like, he's probably gonna be fine. The next book I read is another book by Patrick Modiano called Missing Person. This book is perhaps his best-known book. It's a detective noir novel where the main character has amnesia, and the detective mystery is him trying to figure out his own past by just talking to people. And he's trying to discover his relationship to Paris during, I think, World War II, and his own memories. I think that the concept of this book is great, and I think it's really well done. While I was reading this, I was thinking, wow, I would love a version of this book set in my city. I would love a Sydney version of this book. And I understand why he's so revered in Paris and so loved, because this is such a very clear love letter to a city and the history of it. This book is very sincere, and for its concept, it's very unpretentious. It's also quite funny. There's a lot of very gentle satire on like noir detective tropes. Every now and again, the character will try to be like an enigmatic Bogart, like, yes, I'm the sneaky detective. But then we'll see inside his head and he'll be like, I have no fucking clue what's going on. And most of his detective work is like instinct distinct or just asking questions honestly. The sincerity of the book is part of what makes it funny and part of what makes it quite sort of satirical. There's lots of little quirky moments of description as well. There's a moment where a character who is sitting still is described as embalmed, and I was like, that's just a nice little thing. It's not even really that good, but it's just like, oh, that's cute. But even despite the humor I found in the book, I had no trouble with feeling the tone when it would shift to this kind of melancholic weight on the character. There are moments when the main character would say, this is who I am and this is what I remember, and when you read that you go, nah, I don't believe you. And then a couple of chapters later, he's completely contradicting what he said. And it's kind of sad in a way as he tries to find his life out, and eventually he kind of does. But the book does have the Austerlitz ending as well, which is the best kind of ending, which is to say a non-ending. I love that. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. And after reading 2 of his books, I think that Modiano is an underrated Nobel winner, honestly. And now we can come on to the last book I'm going to talk about in this video. I did finish a couple more before making this video, but I haven't got my notes ready, and I'm currently working through something else, so I won't have all of my notes ready to talk about them here. I'll talk about them in a January video, or I'll talk about them when I do this other potential video that I mentioned earlier. I'll just mention them there. But the last book that I read in December was The Piano Teacher by Elfriede Jelinek. This book is about a piano teacher who's a crazy person. This book also uses a relentless tell-don't-show style, and I'm okay with that if the book just really commits, and this book does. However, I also think that this book would only be interesting to people who find the premise interesting. I don't feel like the book goes further than the premise, and if you find the premise engaging or interesting or something you want to see, then you'll probably enjoy the book. I didn't, and I was just kind of left scratching my head, because I think everything beyond what the author tells you is a shallow pool. I don't think there's depth beyond what is just told to you. And I also don't feel like this book is telling you a lot about the world or human nature. It's just telling you about this situation that could exist. But it's not really at service of anything. The book doesn't really do much. The point you start at is the point you end at. And all the book does in between is just wax lyrical on the main character and her fucked upness. There was a moment early on where the author mentions that the main character doesn't like bad smells. The author then expands on that bad smell thing relentlessly for like 5 pages. And at the end you go, oh, okay, she didn't like bad smells. Okay, cool. Even despite all of the relentless, like, dumping on the reader of shit, you don't take any more than, like, the basic facts of things. There are plenty of moments in this that are disturbing and gross. Full credit to Jelinek, because some of the porny stuff in this book is successfully foul. There are so many moments where I would close read what was being said, and I'd go, okay, so that does have a meaning on a superficial level, but the only reason you said it like that is to sound cool. It doesn't actually matter that you've said it like that. It's only to sound cool. One example is when Erica refers to Clamor or Clamora as being a leper of lust, and the only meaning of that is that she wants to stay away from him, but she finds him hot. And I'm like, oh, he's a leper of lust. Oh, so cool. Here's another one describing sex from the perspective of the boy. Her body is still harmlessly occupied with various gear shifts. Soon, Clemera will make it shift into overdrive. That's really lame, and I'm not sure if the book is trying to put you in that character's headspace to make you understand his kind of youthfulness and his inexperience and his kind of childishness with regards to sex, or if the author is being childish because she thinks it sounds cool. And it's impossible to tell the difference. The author will often just say how the character is thinking without expanding on it. Like, they will go, Clemera thinks this way, but he actually doesn't care for her that much. And so when she does that, it makes me think that sections like the quote I just read are her just thinking that it sounds cool and not her actually getting in the character's head. And again, I find it impossible to tell which is which. I do like the ending of the book, but I think it would work better if you're not just constantly in her head and constantly being reminded of the stakes. It was really obvious by the end that she was going to do something because the book was just insistently implying it. If it was just something she did and then walked away, I'd be like, oh, that's cool. The book is laborious and annoying, and the main character's kind of relationship only got interesting about 2/3 of the way through. So yeah, not a favorite of mine, I'm afraid. So that's everything I read in November and December. Thank you so much for watching. Goalie, it's been a long year. I will be making videos again next year, and they'll probably be a little bit longer. They won't be this kind of regular content. It'll be a little more sporadic. But thank you so much again for watching. God bless, and have a good one. Bye!